We've had a very exciting start, and I would be naive to say that the best is yet to come, because this morning was powerful.
Yes, that's right.
But the best is yet to come. Now we had a little switch around, because this was planned to be in what they call life stages. Early, later. But we switched it around, so I want you to kind of shift back to before 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Before then, you heard some conversation about the importance of reading to children early on. You heard the importance of protecting children from early on. But what I want you to think about, and it has both scientific and religious implications, is that all women are not mothers. And we need not value less any woman that's not a birth mother.
Hallelujah.
The government says maternal and child health as if that's automatic, regardless. But what has evolved in recent years is a whole body of science around women's health. Because all women are not birth mothers. And it raises the question of the interaction, the intersectionality between women and children, and the justice that is, or the injustice for both. But at the other side, because we always try to think about here at Tuskegee, not what we ought not do, but what we ought to do. We always think about doing the right thing as well as doing things right. So I want you to just sit back and be open at the top for some things that you've heard before and some things you may not have heard before. Some things that you agree with and some things that you may not agree with. It really doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree. But we want you to formulate your thinking about what you think about what you heard. Because part of this interaction is our admitting that the experts are both here at the podium and out there with you. So I don't want you to be so selfish to not share your thoughts. We will have time to share your collective thoughts as the day moves on. So let's get this afternoon session started. .com.
Good afternoon, everyone. Did you eat sumptuously? Yes. Yeah, I had delicious. I had some salmon. I'm from the Virgin Islands. They don't say salmon, they say salmon. That's some salmon. So that is not it's some. So now we have ethics and reproductive justice. The moderator for this afternoon is our own bioethics honor student, Ms. Jayla Brown.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Shayla Brown. I am a freshman biochemical engineering major, I'm a part of the bioethics program, on this program, and I will be your moderator for the hour. First, we have Dr. Chu Chu Saunders. Chu Chu Saunders is a mother, pediatrician, and former medical epidemiologist with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where for over 10 years she was involved with issues related to children's health and youth violence prevention. She was also a program officer at the Ford Foundation, Senior Deputy Director of Health in Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia's Deputy Health Commissioner. She served as Senior Deployment Operations Manager for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, Katrina Assistance Project, and a $12.8 million federal response that offered mental health services to both first-line responders and the community in order to reduce trauma-related stress in the disaster-affected areas of Hurricane Katrina. Dr. Saunders is currently a public health consultant and the author of various journal articles and a children's book for girls entitled Oops. Dr. Saunders is also a sought-after motivational speaker and conducts workshops and retreats for youth, parents, teachers, healthcare professionals, and program staff. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chu Chu Saunders.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I love Dr. Kunjuku, but as of today, I don't know, because he gave Dr. Baily and I a tremendous task. It's always difficult to deal with an audience after lunch, especially when it's an academic situation. But trust me, I'm going to do my best. And unfortunately, you know the thing about computers and colors, how they show up differently? If I could show you all really what I had for you, it looked like this. I don't know if I can turn this around. But you see that? Right. That's completely different. Yeah, I was going to really keep you stimulated. Yes, keep you stimulated. And I looked up and I saw burgundy. All right, so let's get started. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm Chu Chu Onwuachi-Saunders, and I was wondering if you would be able to say that, but that's okay. But thank you for that wonderful introduction. Many of you I've seen before because I've been here a bit, and you know me. And I am so honored and humbled by the fact that you're here. It really brings warmth to my heart because the last time I was here was extremely emotional for me. It was interesting when I was coming. I felt the energy as soon as they were driving in to this area, and I could feel it. It has a really special energy. In spite of the fact that it's a very, very sad story, out of sadness comes a lot of joy. Yes. And I don't want you ever to underestimate the energy that's in this area and how one day possibly we can capitalize on that and just bring millions of people here to feel it. Just as they do, they go to Israel and other places around the world to feel that kind of energy. I think it's really here every time I come. So it's definitely here. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for recognizing me and allowing me this opportunity. Dr. Hodge, go forward. So what I want to talk, first of all, is the power of the pants story. I don't know how many of you know that in 1940, women could be arrested for wearing pants in the United States. Some of you probably remember that, right? Some of you are old enough to remember, or your mothers or someone told you. And it was not until 1972 that girls could wear pants to school. As a matter of fact, in 1993, female leaders were actually allowed to wear pants on the Senate floor. And now I've said, this is 2018. I believe female wear the pants whenever, whatever. They are the leaders. They wear the pants in their relationships. They wear the pants if they can in the workplace. In a lot of instances, still not as much as we would like it. But if you have a female supervisor, you know the difference than when you have a male supervisor. We wear the pants. So there's a story. There's a power in the story around us as women. And I want you to understand that as I tell the story of what happened with this particular domain or gender or movement for females around their reproductive health and their reproductive rights and their reproductive justice. And there's certain dates I just want you to remember, kind of, as I begin to tell you this. In 1994, in Cairo, in Egypt, there was an international conference on population and development. And in let's skip to 1995, there was a Beijing +5 conference that happened where the same issues were again addressed. all right, by women. And then in 1994, I just recently found out, doing some little more research, just doing some more, there was a group of black women who got together after the 1994 Cairo experience. And these were the women who really came up with the idea of reproductive justice. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I wanted to put that in because I had just found it and I thought it was good as it related to the history. And then in 1997, something special happened at the Ford Foundation in New York, and that's called A Sister's Song, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I also want to tell you the power of my story. This is a very interesting, this is why I say it's very mystical, kind of intuitive what happened. In 2000 to 2002, I was a sexual reproductive health program officer at the Ford Foundation. When Ford recruited me to come and do sexual reproductive health, it was not my field. I'm an epidemiologist, as she told you. I'm a pediatrician, trained at CDC, did mostly pediatric issues, youth violence, and then all of a sudden now I'm being asked to come and talk to people about, women specifically, about sexual and reproductive health. In 2002, I wrote what they call a program officer memo. Every program officer, in spite of the fact that you're given a portfolio of how much money I had, $3.4 million to give away, they ask you to write what they call a program officer memo, which is called a POM. And at that time, I wrote a POM about women of color. I called it Weaving Webs of Health and Wellness, A Path to Health Justice. And you'll understand the relevancy of that in a minute. And now, 2018, Dr. Warren and Tuskegee asked me to come and give a keynote on a subject I haven't touched since 2002. It was amazing to me. And I thought, wow, how did that happen? And I realized it happened because, for me, I can say I'm a visionary. I'm a person who comes into a situation and I always turn it on its head. I don't believe that change can happen unless there's some disruption. If you're doing things the same way all the time, there's no change, all right? You have to be disruptive in some way. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to disrupt you, but I want you to know that it was a disruption that I had started back in 2002. So it's like about 16 years later that I'm getting to finish it. So this is really special to me. All right, so Webster defines ethics as basically the discipline dealing with what is good and bad and what's moral, right? Or you have an obligation to. And it's a theory or a system of moral values. And reproductive rights is basically the right of an individual to decide whether to reproduce and have reproductive health. This may include an individual's right to plan a family, to terminate a pregnancy, use contraceptives, learn about sexual education in their schools, and access reproductive services. All right, that's the definition of reproductive rights. Different from the definition of reproductive justice. Reproductive justice means the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, social, and economic well-being of women and girls based on the full achievement and protection of a woman's human rights. Now, because they're both, say, reproductive and they're both in that, people tend to, oh, I'm sorry, I gotta stay here because you can't hear me. People tend to confuse the two. They are a little different, and I'm going to help you understand that, and then I'm going to move you to somewhere else. So this is the history of the reproductive health and rights movement, which is important because if you don't know the story, then you can't change it. All right? That's important. So bear with me. I know most of you are coming from lunch, and you're probably really, really sleepy, but I'm really going through this, and I'm going to be finished in 30 minutes, in less than 30 minutes, hopefully. So in slavery, when we were slaves, they forced us to have reproduction, okay? Through the years, women kind of dealt with it, we know about abortion and things like that. But in the 50s and 60s, what happened was organizations began to focus more on population and reproduction. They wanted to better understand why women were having babies. They wanted to really control the population. So a lot of our funding went into that, population growth in developing countries. That's where a lot of money and funding went. In the 70s, we found federally supported coerced sterilization programs, hysterectomies, things like that started appearing for women. In the 80s, the funding involved education and safe and affordable effective contraceptive use and abortion services. All of that began to swell up. In the 90s, there was a shift from this focus on family planning to more of a reproductive health and a women's-centered rights-based focus, which included sexual education, not only for women, but for girls as well. We realized that that was important. And then today, we're still seeing remnants of this whole thing about controlling our reproductive health. If it's not through Depo-Provera and where it's put in our communities, federally supported programs, there are all these issues still around abortion, a woman's right to choose, not choose, all of that. Welfare reform, caps on families as it relates to how many children women can have in order to receive welfare. That's all innocuous ways of controlling our reproductive ability as women. So in 1994, at this conference in Cairo and the subsequent ones, something happened, and this is where the focus changed from just the health focus to more about a woman's right to decide what she wants to have or not have. So at these two conferences, the documents debated and redefined the focus within the reproductive health arena. It helped to create an enabling national and international political environment for reproductive health. People started talking about it more from a global perspective. It wasn't just happening on an individual local level, it was a global conversation now. What also happened at that time was the language began to change. It changed more from just a health, but a right of a woman to decide what she wanted and what she did not want around her reproductive health. And it also intensified the interest of NGOs and advocates. According to the history, there were more advocates at that the 1995 Beijing Plus conference than there have ever been at any international reproductive health rights conference in the world. All right, so women especially became more interested and intensified and wanted to do more around this issue. But in the United States, even though globally women were talking broadly about human rights, in the United States, the national reproductive rights organizations, which were dominated mostly by white women, feminists that everybody talks about, they wanted to just safeguard a woman's right to choose. That's all they wanted to talk about. They became the leading force and remained the leading force in the reproductive rights movement. They were the only ones getting funding to do this work. But unfortunately, they lacked diversity, not only in the individuals. They didn't have many women of color as part of their structure, not their executive boards, their staffing, or any of that. But they also, when you don't have individuals of color that participate or individuals with different perspectives, you lose thought. And so that's why they continue to remain in that domain of just abortion, an abortion right. It's our right to determine whether or not we want to, whether or not a woman wants to have a child or not. That became the total conversation, dominated. And then they didn't have this broad framework of issues that plague women of color, because women of color, it's not just about that alone. It's poverty, it's racism, it's whether I have access or not. Do I have the right relationship with the man that I'm in that will even let me consider to go get an abortion? All of these things were interplaying, and women of color, not only in the United States, but globally were speaking about this, but white women didn't quite identify that. So basically, the reproductive rights movement was dominated by these national organizations, which were dominated predominantly by white women. So in 1997, the Ford Foundation, though, decided to do something a little different. They decided to fund 16 organizations, which were led by women of color, to have a conversation, basically, about reproductive rights, taking into consideration this broader context of rights being more than just my right to have a child. It's my right to have a child or not, but given the context of my existence. So these 16 organizations represented the women of color predominantly in the United States. Were African American, Asian, Pacific Islands, Latinos, and Native American. And not only that, they also represent different programming aspects. Some of the organizations were involved in reproductive STD prevention, HIV/AIDS prevention, midwifery, substance abuse involving women, reproductive rights as a right. There was only actually one organization, which was African American, that was dealing with that particular issue. So Sister Song, as it was called, these 16 organizations, are the ones that brought to bear on the national level this concept of the interrelationship of issues that women of color were predominantly dealing with. And that you could not basically deal with just my right to have an abortion or not. There are other issues that I am plagued with that even come into play. So they had, as a result of their joint effort, they had some themes that emerged that are extremely important as we move on with anything that we do, because these themes keep appearing time and time again for us as it relates to any of the efforts that we are involved in, especially for efforts that we are related to as women of color. So one of the things that they found out was there was not enough information. They couldn't find enough data specifically around women of color. And that happens, of course, because not all the time are the data collecting efforts geared towards women of color, but even if they are, we don't always participate, right? And I see most of the MPH students shaking their head because they know that, right? Yeah, there's just a dearth of information. There's not enough information. There's also a lack of funding to institute programs and increase our awareness. It just doesn't come to us, and I'll explain some of those reasons, but those kind of things are extremely important when you're trying to mount a movement. You need support, you need resources, and we just don't get it. There also were these linguistic and attitudinal issues which created barriers to accessing information and services for women. A lot of organizations will get money from certain funding organizations, think they have to present it a certain way, but it doesn't resonate with the community that they're trying to target, or they're not in tune with the community that they're trying to direct services to. Women often experience challenges in communicating health needs and concerns with their partner. One of the things that I think that's extremely important is that we as women of color sometimes fall into the model that white women have designated, which is we can do this. Women of color, we're connected. Relationships are important to us. We need to understand that. So that still needs to be a part of any movement that we engage in. But it didn't happen in the reproductive rights. It was all about women, it's all about us, we can do this, you know, that kind of attitude, and it doesn't always. And then the science analysis failed to include the social, economic conditions that often experience or aggravate these human rights violations for women of color. And so these things inhibit our women from getting access to care. You know, if you don't have the money to get a bus fare to go to the doctor, you're not going to go. Or if you don't have any trust with that particular provider that you are designated to go to because that's what your HMO provider asks you to go, you're not going to go. So these are issues that were important. The other thing is that there were lessons learned from this Sister Song collective. Basically what they learned is that there's the collective vision among women of color. When it's collected, when it's women joined together, can be extremely powerful. So it needs to be amplified. It needs to be considered, okay? There needs to be more transparency as it relates to how these organizations are funded or not funded. A lot of women of color still don't understand the funding entity that they're going to get money from, to sustain their efforts. Capacity building assistance is extremely important and is lacking. What I mean by that is many women-led community-based organizations don't have a strong board. They don't have a strong financial system. They don't know how to staff up correctly. They don't know how to get rid of staff that they don't want. All of that is important. Advocacy and direct services, both are important for women of color. It's not enough just to be an advocate organization. You also, in many cases, have to offer direct services because that's what your community needs. All right, so the ability to go back and forth between the both is extremely important. And then this continued funding of a grassroots cross-cultural women of color advocacy agenda is what they felt everybody needed to hear. Women of color have a different voice, a different conversation about an issue because of their experiences. So let's keep that conversation going and find it. So Sister Song came up with a definition of reproductive justice, and their definition was the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. So not only do they talk about themselves, but they talk about the children that they're bringing through the reproductive health process, which is extremely important. Okay, so reproductive justice is not about access. It's not a choice or an abortion issue. If you don't have access, then you really don't have a choice, do you? You can't get to the clinic, so you don't have a choice. So women of color, they don't have not only access to abortion, they don't have access to contraception, comprehensive sexual education, prenatal care, STI prevention and care, domestic violence, even safe homes in many instances. So women of color-led community-based organizations are extremely important to any movement that you have, especially when it's dealing with women. Although they don't have the funding, they don't have the capacity building assistance, they don't have the capacity to create actually and sustain a movement focused solely on one issue because they have to deal with many issues. So that's extremely important for us to remember. And they don't always have the capacity to implement the interventions that are necessary to solve the issue. It just doesn't exist. As you probably know in your own communities, there are certain movement organizations that are there for a while and then they disappear after another while. All right, I'm gonna check my time. I got about 10 minutes. Okay, so I've already talked about women of color-led organizations and what they need and this hamster wheel situation that they're in. They're never recognized, they don't have the visibility, they don't have the funding, they don't have it because they don't have the capacity. So this keeps going on and on. So what I propose is what I call a new course or a new movement that we need to consider now. I think that the reproductive justice agenda should now be converted into an optimal health for women of color agenda. And when I say that, I say that because this will allow us to broaden the framework, it will allow us to expand our language and bring in new partners, and it allows us to shift the paradigm to total wellness versus one issue, which is reproductive health. So, if you all don't know, the definition of optimal health here is the best possible emotional, intellectual, physical, spiritual, and social economic aliveness that one can attain. This definition was coined by Dr. John Chizelle, who wrote a book called The Pyramids of Power, which is an African, ancient-centered approach to health. Those of you who've heard me speak before have heard me mention this. I think that his work is phenomenal, and it still hasn't gotten the visibility. So what I'm proposing is that the reproductive justice now shift from just reproductive justice and talk about optimal health and wellness for women of color. With that in mind, what will happen immediately is that we will eliminate a lot of the silos, the limited funding that is coming through for just reproductive health versus substance abuse or other issues for women now will become one big pot. We can eliminate our myopic focus of the mainstream organizations. They think they're competing with us because we're just talking about reproductive health and they already have the funding, they all have the visibility, but now we'll be talking about optimal health for women of color, all right? And it allows us to not be one unifocused in our programming, but most of all, like I said, that selective funding efforts will be broadened if we move into something that's more. This optimal health movement that I'm proposing will have some basic core values, and those values are communalism or a community university, which Dr. Warren mentioned this morning. I smile when he says it. Integrity, discernment, and mindfulness. And under each of those values, you can see some of the things that I think are extremely important. Like under mindfulness, I think Dr. Warren or somebody mentioned this morning about listening deeply. That's extremely, empathetic listening is important. Discernment means that we honor and learn from the elders, and we align our principles and values and consider the impact of all of our choices on our future generations. That's extremely important for movements that I don't think many people have ever even considered, have even thought of as a consideration. So if you look at these 4 core values, I think that they should be the basic core values of any new movement that we engage in, especially as women of color. This new movement I propose should be rooted in our female power. There are 2 bodies of work on that. Womanism, which was Alice Walker's work, which basically alluded to the fact that women have this innate power. And then there's also the concept that you might have heard of called the divine feminine. which also alludes to the fact that we have both male and female sides of ourselves, but our female side is different. If I can give you an example of that. When I was asked to head up the mental health response for Katrina, it was a male effort completely. When I flew into New Orleans right after Katrina on the flight from DC, everybody on the flight was male except myself and the airline stewardess, right? And most natural disaster approaches, if you hear about them even on now, all headed by men. FEMA, you'll see them, they're the ones who talk. So I was the first female that ever headed up a national defense, or not defense, but disaster effort. And it was interesting, I remember now that whole thing was a success because I relied on my divine feminine intuition. When the men would say something, I would get quiet and decide intuitively what I thought was best for the people that I had to deal with in front of me. First of all, if you don't know, adversely affected populations for disasters are the elderly and the people of color. Okay, we just fall out because we don't deal with the system, and the elderly doesn't like systems anymore because they don't feel that they're kind to them. And so I had to rely on my divine feminine side of me to fix what is basically called a male approach. And that's when I began to have the ultimate respect for my divine feminine power. And so I believe that those two theories must be a part of any effort that we as women undertake in the future. We need to build and sustain a collective of women-led, community-based organizations. We need to offer this effective, health movement now, not just reproductive rights. We need to target the social, political, economic, spiritual, and cultural factors that perpetuate poor health outcomes, especially among women of color. And we need to reinforce the capacity so that women of color can prevail their advocacy, not only at the local and state, but at the national and hopefully at the global level. And then most importantly, we need to partner with other allies. And those two allies that I talk about in the paper that I did that is the foundation for this talk, is that first of all is religion. If most of you don't know, religion and reproductive rights haven't quite ever been on the same page. It may appear there are a lot of stereotypes and myths about what religion says and what it doesn't say and how it is supportive of women and it isn't. So most of us know that it's aligned with a conservative ideology as it relates to religion, and most of us also know about the domination and control and disempowerment that religion has imposed on women for centuries. All right, so now I'm saying with this new movement, religion and spirituality have to be a part of it. One of the reasons, first and foremost, is because women who operate within the religious mode, they have poor health outcomes, so we need them as part of the agenda. So we can't alienate them. Spirituality is an integral component of optimal health. You can't have optimal health unless you're spiritually balanced. It's part of the approach, and it's part of the methodology for it. The faith community must also be supportive of us as women of color and not sanction opposite rhetoric. It's so important for the faith community to be on board and be not as against us, but for us. And then progressive religious voices, they need to be encouraged and welcome to any movement that we now intend to compare ourselves in. Also, new players are men. As I said before, the men must be welcomed. Their role must be defined in this particular new movement. Because men hold insights that women may not always hold that can be very, very helpful to improving our health. Their input, and I think their input involvement will be innovative. We've never had men try to help fix women's health. There have been some efforts about women trying to help men, like take your significant other to the doctor. But it's not been vice versa. And I think it's extremely important because for women, we operate within relationships. They're extremely important to us. We may not act like they are, but they will. And we need that support. And we can't do it alone. And it says her struggle is definitely his struggle. That's what I said. So in conclusion, I've tried to highlight some various ethical issues that have arisen in the reproductive justice history. I'm now recommending that we broaden our scope and make this now an optimal health movement for women and girls. And it has to be steeped in this theory of our strength is in our feminism, and also the importance of us taking care of ourselves. And then what will happen is we'll create this fresh language, this new allies, we'll foster different partnerships and strengthen the capacity of a cross-cultural collective of women in order to really change the health of women of color in this country. Thank you.
The responder will be Dr. Randall Baily. Dr. Randall Baily is a native of Malden, Massachusetts, is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of the Hebrew Bible at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. Prior to his work at ICC, Dr. Baily taught at the Atlanta University School of Social Work and served as assistant minister at First Congregational Church, UCC in Atlanta. He is an ordained Baptist minister and has served on the faculty of the Institute of Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University in New Orleans. Dr. Baily has been a visiting scholar at many notable seminaries around the world. Baily has been Dr. Baily, and he is also the author, editor, or co-editor of several books and articles focusing on ideological criticism regarding the intersections of race, gender, class, sex, sexuality, nationality, and power in the biblical text. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Randall Baily.
Before Dr. Baily comes, I look back and I saw people actually lean back in the sleep position. So let's all stand and get a good stretch and take some deep breaths. I know it was a cheesecake. That's what it was. It was a cheesecake. Yeah, so let's all stand up. Everybody stand up. Just stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up. Yeah, now just stretch. Stretch. Now take 3 deep breaths. Ready? Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. One more time. Inhale. Exhale. All right. You have a good stretch? Yeah. Okay. Now let's have Dr. Baily.
No.
That's fine, where's that?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to thank Dr. Saunders for the presentation she did, and when the paper gets published, it will be even better because some information she wasn't able to go through as she tried to fit within her time frame without asking every 2 minutes how much time do I have. I want to talk about this. I am emeritus faculty at ITC. And, as the last statement said, I've been dealing with questions of intersectionality, race, class, gender, nationality, power, sexuality in the Bible and in biblical interpretation. I got into biblical studies because I, in seminary, got intrigued with James Cohen's work on black theology. And I wanted to do the biblical exegesis that would help the black theology movement grow stronger. The problem was that I became an ideological critic and started saying there's problems in the Bible And we can't just say it's in the Word, and the Black theology movement kicked me to the curb because they didn't want to hear that. As I go through this presentation, people might say, how do you say that? And I would say that it is under the guidance of the Spirit that these new thoughts have been given to me. And as a Baptist, we always speak under the guidance of the Spirit. Now, you may disagree with the Spirit that's talking to me, and that's good. But I do have to alert you that we're going to have a little roller coaster ride. My favorite Bible passage is in 2 Kings 2, when Elijah has already gone up in the chariot and the mantle has fallen down on Elisha, and as he's going through 42 boys, these boys come out and start saying, go away, bald head, go away, bald head, and he summons out these she-bears that maul them. My moral of the story is be kind to bald-headed men. You may want to keep that in mind, especially when we get to the discussion. My friend Naim Atik, who is a Palestinian Christian liberation theologian, says in his book, Justice, Only Justice, that this passage in 2 Kings is proof that not everything in the Bible comes from God, because clearly I'm God. We never send our she-bears to maul all those boys by telling Naim it's in the text. I don't know if we want to throw it out, at least I'm not prepared to throw that one out. There is an apocryphal view of Black religious hermeneutics and biblical interpretation. Many Black scholars cite the story that Howard Thurman tells in his autobiography with Head and Heart, where he would read the Bible to his grandmother every night. But she would never let him read from any of the letters of Paul, except for 1 Corinthians 13, to love him. And he asked her why, and she said, because on the plantation, they kept saying slaves be obedient to your master, and they kept trying to go along with that, and I don't want to hear nothing but Paul. Now, biblical scholarship has shown that Ephesians, when we find that statement, is Deutero-Pauline. It's after the Bible. She didn't care. She threw Paul out the Bible. And she shows us that there is a Black religious tradition that says, just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's scriptural. And we have had a way of ignoring, throwing out, and lying about the Bible. When our daughter Imani was in the MBA program at CAU, one of her fellow students came out to see me on a Friday night. They told him, don't come. And he wanted to know how could the daughter of an ordained Baptist minister not believe that wives should be submissive to their husbands. And I had the Bible open, the first gospel, and I highlighted the statement of Jesus that said, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. And he read that. He put the Bible down, picked up and read it again. He said, never. I said, who's speaking there? He said, Jesus. I said, you ever been looking at stuff you weren't supposed to be looking at? He said, yeah. I said, you ever done stuff with your hands that you shouldn't have been doing? Your feet ever taken you some places you shouldn't have gone? He said, yeah, and I had a meat cleaver and a wood block. I said, go for it. He said, go for it. I said, Jesus said, if you do these things you're talking about, pluck it out, cut it off. He said, well, no, this really doesn't mean this. It's talking about. I said, oh, so your hermeneutic is the same as Imani's. if it works to your favor, you say the Bible says. If it works against you, you just say, forget it. So you're just like my daughter, except through different passages that y'all have thrown out the Bible, you know. That's why they told you don't want to come out here. You know? Now, our foreparents tried to tell us that in the spiritual Jacob's Ladder. We are climbing Jacob's Ladder. What? No, but we're climbing Jacob's Ladder. Don't go to the next verse. What's on that ladder? Soldier of the cross. They sang that because the enslavers thought they were really getting into the Bible. Mentioned Jacob and the cross. Who's on Jacob's ladder? That's climbing up and down. Who's on it? Angels. Our foreparents said, hell, we don't need no angels. We need some soldiers. Because the cross is a place of political contestation. So they changed the story. And they did it in a trickster way so that the other enslaved folk in the brush arbor would understand. But the ones that didn't go to the brush arbor, they wouldn't get it. And the slavers would say they buy in the Bible. The problem, I think, that happened was that they forgot to tell their children that they were being tricksters. And their children ended up loving Jesus uncritically. And we stuck with that. We don't have to. We just have to know that that's what we're dealing with in terms of, and what I'm really trying to do is say that what I'm going to do with some of these stories now grows from an Afrocentric hermeneutic. And it's part of our religious understanding. Not everybody did, because and I can't help myself. Like Lila said, I don't want to do wrong, but I can't help myself. In the steam room, at the gym, I'm up there talking about Jacob's Ladder and the problems there. And slaves be obedient to your master, and some Negroes will say, but you're supposed to do what the boss tells you. I said, don't say no boss. It says your master. And it don't say a worker, it says a slave. And that somehow we've lost our heritage. And I'm trying to help us get back to that. So, as I approach reproductive justice, how much time I got left? You didn't start telling me either. Good, praise God. Okay, you see how the Spirit works. See, Sister Saunders, you see that Spirit working here. The divine feminine is going, yeah. Okay, I just want to look at a couple of stories that we may or may not be familiar with that deal with reproductive justice issues. And I want us to broaden that, the optimal faith issues. In Genesis 16, we have the story of Hagar. Abram's wife Sarai can't have a baby. She tells him, go into Hagar, and then I'll get a child after her, and Abram goes into her. When I was lecturing on this in Seoul, I said, he raped her. And the translator said, right, I said, it said, he took her, she's a slave, he's a master. There's no way you can get that by rape. And so he continued translating. The folks that understood both languages said, no, that's not what he said. Because folks didn't want to believe that this is a story of rape. And when I do this story in black churches, sisters tell me that Hagar is the other woman. I said, anybody in here know someone who is or was a domestic? Everybody raise their hand. I'd say, okay, don't raise your hand no more. Anybody here know of a domestic who was sexually assaulted by the man or the woman in the house where they work in? So we know this story. But we won't deal with it in that way. You don't want to start talking about the other woman as opposed to what happens to many black women and boys and men. And Hagar runs away and she meets the Lord. And the Lord said, "Where you coming from? Where you going?" And she said, "I'm running from my mistress Sarah." And he said, "Go back and submit to the oppression of your mistress." And then here's the good news. Your son's going to be a wild ass of a man. Every mother wants to hear that. When I preached on this text at a Baptist church in Brooklyn, I said that this is not our God. Because our God is a God of liberation. Our God, this is Dred Scott, our God would not send a slave back and say, submit to the oppression. Our God is one who wants us to be free. And the folk in the church, unlike some of y'all, was starting to shout. And when you listen to the tape, you hear, while I'm talking about this God of liberation, and that's not the one in the text, you hear the voice of the radio announcer saying, "You've been listening to a sermon by a visiting minister at our church." But you can still hear the folks shouting, because they were glad to hear that we have a God who understands what happens to people who get sexually molested. Now, what's Sodom and Gomorrah about? What's that story about? Oh, come on, y'all can tell me what Sodom and Gomorrah is about. Homosexuality, yeah. You see, visitors come to the town, and Lot brings them to his house, and all the men of the city surround the house. That sounds like a militaristic move to me. And they said, "Send out the men so we should know them." Well, we know when the spies went to Rahab's house, the king said, "Send them." Nobody thought the king was going to screw them. It's when strange people are there, they want to know, are they spies? That's why all the men of the city, young and old, have surrounded them. And Lot says, "Here, pull a train on my daughters." And when I put this interpretation on a website of a radio announcer in Atlanta, several women said, "But he was trying to protect the men, the visitors." And I said, and I had the same discussion with Roland Martin and his wife, what have we done in the church to the spirituality of women, that when there's a story about sexual violation of daughters, we believe it has something to do with homosexuality, and you ought to throw your daughters out to save some men. There's something about the way in which we taught women to hate themselves, to do what men say. These stories are very dangerous. And it has nothing to do with homosexuality. Now, there are stories that have to do with homosexuality. Yeah, I won't go into that. And they're favorable. I do have to go to this. I already told you the problem. Where you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God, and we'll be together until death do us part. What is that? Okay. Well, where do we find that story? Ruth. And in fact, where do we use that story now? And what ceremony do we use that? In marriage ceremonies. Who was Ruth talking to? Naomi. This is a pledge from one woman to another. And we talking about the ain't queerness already in the Bible? I mean, but that's a positive view of queerness. And then chapter 3, Naomi said, our economic situation is kind of bad. We got to do something else. And so Ruth goes down and has some with Boaz. And then when they get a baby, Boaz falls off the story. And the women say, Ruth has had a baby for Naomi. But we can't see because we know everything about homosexuality in the Bible is bad, especially when it comes to women, number one. because there's a whole genre of stories called barren wife motif, where there's one husband, two women, one has babies, one doesn't, and they're all fighting at each other, because clearly women can't get along together. The basic assumption of these stories is the main function of women is to turn out babies for men. That's why you get all these begat passages where the woman isn't even mentioned. So the man begat, I don't know who would do it, and they all have sons. I don't care about having daughters. The angel says to Mary, I need your body. I need a son. And she said, how can that be? I'm pregnant. Don't worry, it won't hurt. And Dr. Earl, who's been here, has said that he's worked with girlfriends and women of gangbangers, and when they went to that, one of them said, that's what they all tell us. This is a story about the sexual abuse of a teenager. And she then sings the Magnificat. The gospel according to Bill Withers. If using me makes me feel this good, then use me up. Because the message is, if you are abused, be glad that God is on your side. And don't deal with the abuse and go along with the abuse. I would say, and I'll say some other things for the discussion, but I want to end with the 10th commandment. You should not covet your neighbor's wife. You should not covet your neighbor's house or his field or his ox or his donkey or his male or female slave or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Which means the wife is just like the house, the donkey, the slave, a piece of property that belongs to in the social location of the you has to be an upper class man who has a house, field, an ox, donkey. And this is the 10th commandment, which starts out, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and then say, but y'all can become slave masters now. And there is a denomination, I won't call it out, that does the extended Decalogue first Sunday every month. And somehow, folk in the congregation don't catch what this is saying about women, and then now we can understand why in Alabama they wanted to put the 10 Commandments in the courthouses, because they want to go back to slavery and disempowerment of women. But most of us, like it's in the Word, it's got to be good, as opposed to taking the concept that Dr. Saunders put out there in terms of optimal justice, in terms of reproductive justice, in terms of what you're learning in courses here on hegemony, what you're learning about patriarchy and the problems of patriarchy, what you're learning about the views of foreigners, and how this man up there can say, I don't want anybody that ain't white coming here. And take that and read that in the Bible. And when you see it, don't hide from it. Say, well, that's how they were back then. Let's hope there's a different God that's helping us in what struggles we're going through. Or we can just go down the faith.
Okay, take a couple of minutes to form your questions.
write down your questions so you know exactly what you want to ask, and we take some other deep breaths, and you can stand up and talk to someone about the question you want to ask. But more than anything else, you can wake up. Warm table, you already have the AC turned on, so you should be feeling something in about 5 minutes.
Any questions?
Excuse me, before I ask the question, we really need the audience to stay silent, because you can realize that the sound travels upon like an amphitheater.
I have a question. I don't know how much you've done any studying of women in Africa, because I see your last name, but I'm not sure if it's shit. So, you know, over there, the females have their vaginal areas sewn together, and I wasn't sure how they've been treated. Is that included in your, you know, anything? Okay.
Was she speaking about is female circumcision?
Mike,
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. She's speaking about, she asked me a question because she noticed that my last name was of African descent, which I am. I'm Nigerian. My father was Nigerian. She's asking about female circumcision and whether I know if it's on the increase or decrease. Well, first of all, it's secretive. Okay. So a lot of women don't necessarily voice that it has been done to them now more than ever, but it is still being done. Yes, in certain parts of Africa, it still is. It's an issue that the World Health Organization is concerned about, as well as the UN. So there are efforts that have been funded to decrease it, but I'm not sure specifically if it's on the decline. I know that it's still prevalent.
Excuse me, Dr. Sanders, we have young people in here, students or students. Can you explain what it is so that we will know?
Well, female circumcision is basically a procedure where a young girl, it's instituted against young girls because of the males' fear that they become more sexually aroused or more vulnerable to sexuality. So what they do is basically they cut off the clitoris, which, as you know, is the sensitive erogenous zone for women, and they cut it off. But unfortunately, the way that they cut it, what they do is they disfigure it. And so a lot of young women, their vaginas are also mutilated in the process, and when it's sewn up to keep the bleeding from occurring, there's a lot of scar tissue that can occur in that area. So when women go on to get married and eventually have sexual encounters with their husbands, it can lead to a lot of problems. Also, women have died from it because of the infections, and there's a horrible stories associated. But it's basically done by men. The theory is a male theory. But women take their daughters to have it done because they believe in the concept.
There is also, although there is also genital mutilation of men through circumcision, but it's done in a way that is not as horrific as what happened, the patriarchal way of dealing with women. Not everybody. There's also the foreskin is much more sensitive for men, just as the clitoris is more sensitive for women. And so somebody thinks they ought to get rid of the sensitive stuff, just do it better for men than for women, and that speaks to the problems of patriarchy and thinking of women as the property of men, and we shouldn't have.
So, my name is Annie Shamim. I am a student of Master of Public Health from Morehouse School of Medicine, and my question to Dr. Chu Chu is related to safe female circumcision. I know that's their culture, you know. So, but is it unethical because they are damaging the woman's body and they are mutilating it? So, what do you say about that?
Is it unethical?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Definitely. Why do they
Because-
practice?
Why do they do the practice?
Yeah.
Because it's steeped in domination of women, control. And they don't want women to have, or girls to have the same sexual arousal that they experience. Right? Because that's where it comes from. Obviously, you always see things from your perspective. So they're imposing this, what they call a sanction or control effort, not just from the mere fact that they don't want them to experience sex until they decide, which they do. A lot of girls are subjected to marriage at early ages in African and other countries, and Asian countries, because men are ready to have sex with them. That's what it's all about. So yes, I do think it's extreme. And I hope that I live long enough to see that it's eradicated from this earth, because it's not right. And I, as a pediatrician, I can't say, let me say this, I was never a strong supporter of circumcision for babies, for male babies. Because of the fact, from my perspective, it's painful. Extremely painful. That's when men experience pain. They don't even know when they experience that type of pain. I've seen how babies cry. Yes. No matter how we would give local anesthesia to the area, they would still cry. And they would cry for days. And mothers couldn't soothe them and make them feel better. And I know now that that has a ramification on them from an ethereal level, from the spiritual level. There's no way you can eradicate that pain. So that, for women, is even more horrific for me. That's unnecessarily, because they're older, and then you know that you get to be this age, and you're scared as a young girl that that you know as a history and stories, somebody's going to take you off and slice you, and you're left to bleed and make it. If you can or if you don't. Some do, some don't. Because they don't have access to services, medical services. And even more importantly, they don't take them to the services because they know that what they've done is not right. It's not ethically right or not.
And I have one more question. So, do they, I know it's not allowed here in US, but like if they come and say like we belong to the culture, and in our culture it is allowed to do that. So do they doctor practice here?
Are you asking me if they can?
Yes, if they are from Africa or Nigeria, right? And they are going to doctor and they are asking for their daughter that do female circumcision all the time.
They can't.
It's not allowed, right?
No, you can't.
Is your question, is it done lawfully or is it done at all here?
It's not done lawfully, and it's not either way.
Because for my study, it's still done, just not done lawfully.
She's saying in the United States.
I'm talking about the United States, because because the culture, the culture is internal and external. So when I come from where I come from, I'm bringing my culture with me. And if this is an important practice in my culture at home, it's an important culture in my practice in my culture here. So I think what I'm also hearing the question is not why it's illegal, but why it's unethical. And so I heard part of the answer being because it represents a male domination action. But is there any way, and what you also said, mothers take their daughters to do this, which goes to a point I made earlier in terms of something being institutionalized. So the mothers think that the practice is acceptable, her mother did it, her grandmother did it, so on and so forth. How do we end a practice of this sort, as painful as it is, I said this, because circumcision at Israel cultural practice has become an American cultural reality practice? How are these practices to be ended? How can we close them up in an ethical framework? What can we say that will shut them down? Who are the spokespersons to call for this?
Dr. Baily.
On the one hand, there has to be discussion and problem solving with people that have that cultural thing to get to look at what are the issues involved and what really are they trying to do. It's kind of like what I was trying to do today, to give folk a chance to think about what's this story really about and what's really at hand, so that I don't know if we can ensure that it won't happen, but they can't say that they haven't chosen to be oppressive. And also, the discussion has to involve not only the parents but the children. You know, in Joshua 5, the circumcision is done to teenagers as an initiation to warrior status. They didn't know nothing about the 8th day. There are these practices of mutilation as a way of bringing people into adulthood and at the same point controlling them in their adulthood. And if we want to eradicate them, we have to really have a serious discussion and dialogue of what's really being done and why, and how do we help folks look at other alternatives. Yes?
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 Also, I think it's extremely important. If you remember the two conferences I spoke about, Cairo and Beijing, and what happened in Beijing was when they began to say that women needed to be taught about their sexuality. It wasn't just about reproductive health and rights as it relates to reproduction, but your sexuality is important. If we can get to a point where women can be accepted for their sexuality, truly accepted for their sexuality, in the sense that they have expressed it in this country for years. So any of you think that pornography and all these things are easy, then I think it can happen. It will happen. Also, I think it's the role of women, those of us who are committed to teaching girls about the divine feminine. And part of that is being okay with your sexuality, no matter what men tell you. I'm not saying it to the point of you need to go and express your sexuality with another woman. I'm not talking about that. But the sexuality part, what people equate to the sexuality, is our femininity, our sensuality. That's our strength. It's not something that should be controlling or eradicated. It's our intuitiveness. It's part of our intuitiveness. We feel and we express a different way from that. Or we're more into that part of ourselves. What has been happening in this society is everybody wants to make everybody a man. I'll give you all a very excellent example. No one can argue with me about this. Black Panther. the movie Black Panther. Everybody thinks it's so good because women kick ass. Black women were kicking ass in that movie, excuse the expression. The warrior. That's not our femininity. I would have loved to have seen the writers allow the women to so-called kick ass by making men fly across the room with their minds. Or making them subjective. Remember how Spock would not touch anybody, but he could do it with his mind? That's our feminine power. Not the fact that we have to move into our male energy and kick and start. It's not us.
That's right.
We're women. We have powers.
Yep.
We've never been allowed to develop those powers because we live in a male-dominated society.
Amen.
But at the same time, we need those men. Many of us, that's how we thrive. Let's be honest about it. So let's find that compromise and let's put it in a model that works for us. That's what I'm saying. That's what this is about next. Or we'll never eradicate these numbers. We'll never change the poor outcome of the women of color subjected to because we have to take all of these things into consideration. But let's shift them.
When one looks at Proverbs 1-9, wisdom is a female and is a deity. It has all the powers of a deity. When wealth is controlled by her, so it's also classes. And your ability to rule comes from her. And in chapter 8, she is a co-creator with the God of Israel. She was there from the beginning. She was a master worker. And in chapter 9, she sends out her women to come bring people to sit at my table, to eat my bread and drink my wine. And I wonder who copied that notion of having folks eat wisdom's bread and drink their wine. I wonder who was at table.
What do you think?
I wonder.
Make it more clear.
I didn't hear it.
That's the last one, right?
I can hear it.
Jesus is mimicking what this wisdom deity has. At the same time, when we look at Song of Songs,
Use your mind.
garden locked is my sister, my love, and there is a watery pathway through this garden. So what's being described? What's that? There's a channel going through the garden. Well, what's being described? Anybody got an idea of what my sister, my bride has that's got water going through it? Oh, come on, don't make me work harder. But yeah, vagina. And then he says, and there's cinnamon, aloe, saffron, all these spices. How does speaker know that all of these spices are in the channel? How do you find out? How does she find out? What's being described here? Come on. Okay, I'm going to that seems like cunnilingus is being described in the Bible. And it seems like, why do we think the Bible is against sex? And why is it so difficult to answer my question? That's because we've been taught that sex is nasty, and especially engaging in oral sex is real nasty. So don't tell me it's in the Bible.
Yes, I'm a real person. And I'm wondering, okay, I'm Will Christian, and I have a simple question. I think it's simple. Has anybody ever interpreted these stories the way you are, Kevin? Why haven't we heard about it?
Because just like in female genital mutilation, folk want us to stay enslaved. Folk want us to not see the empowerment of women. Folk don't want us to see that what happens to women in patriarchal societies is wrong. And so, folk, I would have students say, but Doc, you got fired as Minister of Christian Education at that church. I can't go to the church and say that. So I've said it in other churches, and isn't our religion one that when you get fired, there's something on the other side of being done in? Are you just too afraid to free the people? And so, I think most clergy think that our power comes from adherence to the word, as opposed to the engagement with the people, and standing with the people when they are hurting, and standing with the people when they're joyous, and helping the people move in political ways to help all the community. Instead, the church is trying to say, just preach and make them happy, and don't liberate them. And so that heritage we had, you ever see Beloved? Ever see the movie part of Beloved?
Yeah.
Part of it, it's good, but in Baby Shook's sermon, she says in the book, and she never told them to go and sin no more. Now, who used to tell folk to go and sin no more? Yeah, she's saying, forget that, because you're going to sin. Our people's experience with the tradition was to be playful with it, and to say some of it don't work. And the reality is most clergy don't want to deal with that, because then they'd have to get involved in the revolution. I think that could be wrong.
Good afternoon again, and thank you for your presentations. I guess I'm going to have to do a lot of penance and prayer. Just want everybody to laugh and wake up. Come on. And that's true, daily, right? Or maybe every hour. No. So I just wanted to touch upon a tiny fragment of reproductive justice, touching on the reproductive life plan of a woman. And in the United States, we have 6 million pregnancies, and 40% of them are unintended. And we always look to the woman. And I must say that there is, again, a movement through the United States on federal funding that really looks at that woman's option of looking at their reproductive life plan. But we're not only looking at women anymore, because we need to look at the men also. Because that's certainly a two-way tango, yeah? And so, yeah, it takes two. But still, there are many communities that don't really address that one key question. Do you want to get pregnant in the next year? So the March of Dimes and the federal government is really looking at that widespread movement to prepare that woman, or to not prepare the woman should they not want to be pregnant, but at least understand what that reproductive life plan means for them and the future of generations. So I just wanted to share that with everyone. Thank you so much.
You're making me think about that word, unintended. Yes. If you dial it back to that moment that two people are having that encounter, and whatever reason, there are times when I will include women who are raped, and that's excluded from this conversation. But we're talking about many of those unintended pregnancies are pregnancies where women are in relationship with some kind of, they're in a relationship with a male, they have a sexual encounter. It is in the essence of love. And this life form is brought to bear. And then they have a second thought about it. And then we call it an unintended pregnancy. We give it a term. That's why I said that it's so important for us to as women to sit down and really think about all of this, all that we're in, all the language needs to change, all the perspective needs to change. Because it's really, at that moment, that's not what it was. Do you understand what I'm saying? At that moment, most of the women in the room can identify with what I'm saying. You know, it's afterwards, you don't want to be with that man or something happens or whatever, but at that moment, it was an act of love. And so, it's so important that we look at our language. And I'm not, you know, when you said it, I thought about it. Because one of the things I talked about is a new movement will allow us to form a new language around things that are really important and sacred to us. Children are sacred. They're sacred. You know, this whole concept of unintended pregnancies and not wanting children came out of a system that really was looking at how to keep people of color from reproducing. Really.
Yeah.
We really need to sit down and think about this and take ourselves down another journey and really explore what has happened to us and how we don't even realize that many of the phrases that we use, the words, the way we act, really keeps us in this so-called bondage. You know?
I would also say that what happened in Alabama in the Senate race has scared the mess out of folks. Because it's not only black folks, but it's also women. And that's why that man's rhetoric is much more not only racist, but patriarchal. And the media isn't calling him on his patriarchy.
That's right.
And the reality is, how many people remember Phyllis Schlafly? How many of the old people remember Phyllis Schlafly? She was a white, middle class woman who ran around the country fighting against the Equal Rights Amendment and got it stopped. People can always find people from the oppressed group to do their work. And the question comes, how do we use our own experiences of oppression to learn from them in terms of how do we get in solidarity with other people? This anti-gay and lesbian stuff, when I hear people say to me after I preach, I'm so glad this is the first time I ever heard from the pulpit that I can love my gay or lesbian child. And I said, why do you come to a place that teaches you to hate your child? Why doesn't your experience with your child tell you that there's craziness in this place? Because we've been taught not to be able to engage the forces that are in power and are crushing us. So I can't really just, vamp on these folks. We gotta be able to help folks see what this oppression is and how they're interlocking and keeping a bunch of folk from getting life abundant.
I was going to touch on what she said about the unintended pregnancy. We can't necessarily change the way society and the government words how we reproduce. But we can change the language between our mothers and our daughters. Something my mother told me, my mother right here, but when I wanted to start having sex, she said, every man you lay with, be prepared to make a child with that man. I said, whoa, I don't know about all that. And that, with that mentality stuck for me because I knew who he was as a person, the things that I saw, so that deterred me from a lot of things. And she made me realize that every time I lay with someone, no matter how much precautions I take, there's an opportunity for me to mother that child with that man. She said, if you want a connection with that person for that long, then commit to that and you lay down. And that was a dialogue that her and I had. It didn't deter me for a very long time. My first time I was 24 years old. But the fact that she had that conversation with me and didn't give me the outlook, oh, you can get an abortion, you can get pregnant, it was, no, be prepared. This is what you have to be charged with this once you choose that. And those conversations happen between mothers and daughters and fathers and daughters and fathers and sons. Same thing with sons. You live with that woman, be prepared to be a father to her child. That will put things in perspective. So I just think if we change the dialogue between the parents and children, have that open conversation, because in the past, we didn't talk about that. We gave you a pad, you learned about the period, we gave you condoms, went on about your business, and we hoped you didn't come home. But those conversations have to happen now because, I mean, I'm a teacher. I got 6th graders pregnant walking around, and their mamas is 30, they're 12, grandma's 41. I mean, it's crazy, and because those conversations are happening, and they're all blessings, with generational curses are continuing to happen. So I just wanted to say that conversation meant a lot to me because it made me realize, you know what I mean? If you think about how you go to keep the club the next night, you're thinking, you ain't got his shoes on right to me. Why don't we 18 years, so I know this man, he got a job, he in college, he ride with me now.
And also, you have to take into consideration his family, who he's related to, you're bringing all that in, you know.
She's scared me straight.
We don't have this conversation, and that's what it is.
Part of that is also the need for intergenerational dialogue, serious dialogue. I was consulting with one of my former students who was going to teach on Hannah. And when Elkanah says to her, aren't I like 10 sons to you? I said, yeah. The narrator left out. She said, yeah, you leave your mess all over this house. You don't put the toilet seat down. No, yeah, you just like 10 sons. And he was pretty preach that.
Yes, I have the thread of these conversations. Just kind of bring something back up in the Long Green Tree Fund. And as this young lady said in a conversation with her mother, the mother said, be prepared for anyone you live with, you give an opportunity to produce a baby connecting with that person for 18 years of life, right? Yeah. And, or, now she didn't tell you this one, you said, but the option, though unspoken, was there, or you could have an abortion, right? But then Dr. Williams said, it takes two. I think he said that. I'm always intrigued, if they talk about justice, why is it that justice seems to be such a masculinist term used by femininity, and the man has no justice if he wants the child when both of them decide to live together? Now you can be mad at me, it's okay. That's what the discussion is about. What if he wants the child? And she said, no, certainly if she says no, it's a no in terms of I want to have an abortion. But isn't there value, you said, the value to children, and then Dr. Saunders, in your talk, you didn't use the word fetus, but you used the word child, which is a different term. And because I've never seen a woman who said, I want to have a baby, said, well, I just want to have a wonderful fetus right now. I have a beautiful zygote. They typically say, my baby. So from the time you say child and baby in the womb, you are giving it personality, giving it personhood. You're giving it something that will have agency soon enough. So the question I have is, how do we speak to, if justice is fairness, how do we speak to justice for the young man who wants that baby that both of them decided, you said it correctly, nice I should say, that it was, in terms of unintended, it was intended that moment. So therefore, how is it that he has totally obliterated options in that regard, and that is justice?
Dr. Baily, that question.
Because he knows to be the one raising that child.
No, what I'm saying that he wants to raise a child. If
he wants to raise a child, then let them get together with somebody where they have a previous discussion and say, I want a child. Are you willing to carry it for me? And then I get out your hand, you know.
First of all, one of the things that I talk a lot to
seconds, and I'm gonna tell you in a minute something about what he said. But one of the things that I impart to girls is how powerful we are. And his question just reiterated. Can you imagine? Somebody wants to have a child, but you have the decision to decide whether or not you're going to do it. And I've told girls this over and over again. If you buy everything in a room that was made by a human being, or develop the concept of a being, and that human being was wrong, nobody else in the world can bring other people to each other. We are the center of power. Where we lost that essence that we were is because we allowed men to control us. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't something to be said for a situation where a male wants it and a woman doesn't. But I think Dr. Baily is correct. He needs to be with the woman that will have it, not the one who didn't.
Well, to be fair,
Or doesn't.
to be fair, the reverse should be true, that she needs to play with a man. So the reverse is true, that's a justice issue for you.
Yeah, that's right.
She needs to play with, like she said, his shoots aren't even on correctly. She needs to be with a man who she wants to raise a child with.
Yeah, right. And then, unfortunately for men, white women took that even further and said, even if she doesn't, she has the right to decide whether or not she wants it, and she can determine it. Not with your input at all. Right, okay. So that's another dilemma, right? But it's a reality for us. Yes. All
So Dr. Mann, I would like to
Let's fight first. No, you can hold that one, but.
Dr. Bell, I would like to ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
We're going to get back to Lot. Like when going in the Solomon Gomorrah, when you said, well, who was he talking to? Well, who was he talking to who was talking to Lot when he told his family to get out, flee from Sodom, because all of this corruption was going on there, and start running and don't look back until you go into the mountain. And when he asked a lot of people, but only he got with his own family, his wife and his 2 daughters. But now his wife looked back, she saw all that wealth back there, she looked back, so she turned into a total stop. But when they took him into the mountain, his 2 daughters wanted to know, how was they going to have kids after they destroyed Sodom? So they got their father drunk, and they had sex with him. So who was they talking to at that time? So who was,
I mean, like, the claim is that God is directing this, and so this man who was willing to have his daughters raped by all the men in the city, why didn't God leave his butt and take the girls away from him? And then you've got the wife and the mother is turned into a pillar of salt, so there's nobody to protect the daughters from this guy. And the rest of the story is that they seduce him, not that they say he's too drunk to know their lives how to get up. He's so drunk he can get it up too and get both of And that's where the Ammonites and the Moabites come from. And my argument in an article that deals with these stories is Israel often depicts the foreigner as someone who practiced sexually taboo behavior, and thereby we can do whatever we want to them. And that seems that in the article is nothing but a sexual behavior. And it's based on this story. So right, this is how the story goes. And if it is God directing this, then that type of God ain't gonna help us.
so you can say that it wasn't God directing him, it was Satan?
I'm saying that in the story, it is God saving him. It's God's message is saving him. And I'm asking, can we trust such a God who would act in that way? That's the question I'm trying to put on the table. In fact, and I'm glad you can push it, because that's what I'm saying. When we read these stories, even if it's God, in the story, when God says to Hagar, go back and submit to the oppression of your mistress, and she says, I'm going to call this Elroy, because I future home character. I know you're not going to be on my side. You're the God of the oppressor. But I don't have an alternative, so she goes back.
Well, see, like, a lot of ministers don't even preach about a lot of the scriptures that's in the Bible. They never go to those type of scriptures where they have asking questions about, people ask questions about. Some of them they skip. And I could never understand why they would do it, because it seemed like it's not the work of God if you go skip scriptures. If you go read it, you got to read the whole thing.
Okay, so Dr. Hodge, I would like to add comment. It's not a question, it's a comment regarding your question. So what I have read in medical ethics, like fetus belongs to the mother, to the woman till it's born. So it's a woman's decision. Either she would like to carry the baby or she would like to abort. It's not depend on the man's will, you know. So after it's born, then obviously she can carry it, she can give it to the man. So that's what I read.
We've been associating reproductive rights with females. Would you comment with the exegete of the narrative in Genesis about Onan, Genesis 38, and maybe project what that will mean as America becomes less a Christian nation?
I got into writing about the Bible, sex, and sexuality because a pastor in D.C., Dennis Wiley, called me and said he had a member who's 35, divorced, and she wanted to know whether masturbating was permissible because of the story of Onan. He said, what should I tell her? I said, tell her that Onan wasn't practicing masturbation. It was coitus interruptus. Nothing. Jesus. Tell her, as a woman, when there are patriarchal stories, stop injecting herself into them, let that patriarchy run, and get herself some good batteries. The church turned the story of Onan into the concept of onanism in terms of masturbation. There's nothing story of masturbation. And that's one of the passages where it says when Onan knew that the child wasn't going to be his, every time he went into her, he spilled his seed. Here's another verse where Noah appears, but it's not the verb for intercourse. It's when he went into her. So, I mean, it's in the same verse, so it's no, it actually could mean knowledge. Adam knew Eve, he actually got to know her before they had children. Wouldn't that be nice? You know, but we have been given concepts that reinforce oppression of women, and women often, as many oppressed people do, because we can see it the way black folk will get there working for Trump. That the oppressed will join the oppressor.
So Bonham was an example of men having reproductive rights and reproductive justice.
Yeah. He did, because they had what's called levirate marriage. That if someone dies and he doesn't have children, then someone's got to impregnate the widow, and that child will be named after him. And that's what Naomi and Ruth are trying to do. They need somebody so they can inherit the property. And if you don't let, I was told by one of the presidents at ITC, because students would always go and complain that I talk about Ruth and go having sex on threshing floor. And I would either have deans or presidents say to me at some moment, hey, one dean pulled out a piece of paper and said, why did you, and I was talking about something else. And one president asked me, why would I say that? And I said, you want my exegesis? You want me to walk you through how I get to that reading? He said, no, I just don't want you to teach that because people could get the idea that premarital sex is okay in the Bible. I said, it is. It's okay more for the man than it is for the woman. It's not a biblical concept. You gotta educate out sex outside of marriage. But the thing is, in my reading of the story, Boaz thinks he's in charge, and he's really being played by Ruth and Naomi. You did something special to me. He doesn't even know he's being used because he thinks he's in charge. That's what I said. If you don't want people to do these types of things, then you've got to create a society where they do have economic options. And they do have correct cultural options, other than being locked into leaning on the person. Because the others have made that work.
Back here first.
Hello, I'm a pastor of 26 years, and some things are not taught in the Bible from the pulpit because it's served in a counseling capacity opposed to a pulpit. Because some of the things the brother is saying is correct, but we don't discuss it publicly because everybody has different views. That's why we don't preach it from the pulpit.
I wanted to say something to you about, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing the conversation between you and your mother's so much. I'm going to give her a hug. That's amazing that she said that to you. More importantly, you know, you had said that it is a conversation between mother and daughter. I think we're going to have to live some of those conversations out of that relationship, because there are many girls who don't have mothers who share that need to hear that message. And once they hear it, they get it. Oh my God. You understand? So we're going to have to do some work around that.
I do understand, my brother, the notion that one should not raise these issues in the pulpit. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that, is it okay for a man to touch a woman? He said, no, but if you can't keep it in your pants, get married. Now, that's not a good reason for marriage. And then he said, when you get married, you no longer control your body. The husband controls the wife's body, the wife controls the husband. I don't know. Well, you give up control of your body. And then he said the only reason not to have sex is because you want to pray. Which means that Paul doesn't understand that there is a spirituality to sexuality. He just thinks it's passion that doesn't have a spirituality. And when I preached that at Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, one of the women deacons came by afterwards and said, Dr. Baily, when I asked my husband if we want to pray today. When we can get sexuality into the spiritual realm, then a lot of the problems can be solved. But at the same point, the country got to stop, number one, Me Tooing the congregation and the folk there. But it isn't any long, and I'm sure it ain't happening in this community. That oppressive stuff keeps working. But if we can move more to spirituality and have a discussion of what is the spirituality of sexuality, then we don't have to be afraid of it. And it isn't whose power is over whose power. But it's a shared commitment of relationship.
Dr. John Chizel's book on the Afrocentric approach to Africa, how he talks about sexuality and spirituality. You can't separate the two, according to him. So that's another reason why I think that needs to be a theory that can help us change our health.
All right, you being a pediatrician and you seeing children that come in of reproductive age, how have you done anything in talks with those children as far as with them, their parents, and trying to elevate the conversation, what she said to them, to make sure that they understand the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive justice? Because we have the problem with unintended, really, and I can truly say that children having sex with other children, I don't think that's intended. I think it's unintended. I don't think, the life that's produced from that, the child that is produced from that, is one, I don't know if they're thinking about what they're doing. They're just looking for something in someone else, for companionship, for love, or whatever reason. So can you address that?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer this, and you may not think it answers, but one of the things that I've done is I'm an author. I wrote a children's book for girls about their first period because I feel it's the most significant pivotal milestone for women. Because of the fact that men tend to think of us a certain way when we are here, we tend to think of ourselves in a certain way, but most importantly, that it is a representation to me of the divine feminine. Because, as I said, only a woman can bring another person into the world. So the book teaches the girls that their period is really a gift. It's an internal clock that comes on every month to tell them to take care of themselves. Because self-care is something that I think is truly missing, especially for women of color. Let me give you a statistical reference to that. Suicide rates in the United States are lowest among women of color. You know why? Suicide is a purely egotistical behavior. You are thinking of no one but yourself at that moment. Women of color don't have that issue. They just don't have that, but always. And we're always overdoing it, People have to tell us to stop and take care of ourselves. Somebody outside of us has it. We don't feel comfortable taking care of ourselves. Self-care is important. So I wrote that book with that in mind so that we can begin to teach a new generation how to be as women. Not only their power, but understand the importance of their self-care as it relates to that. So that's a new conversation that that's good to hear.
Not to deal with shame.
Yeah, especially not to deal with shame as it relates to having your period. Because what happens is many girls have very close relationships with their fathers. And once they have their period, it's like, she's different. Yeah, go let your mom deal with you. You know what I mean? But no, I've even had the editor of the Washington Informer, when she had her period, her father gave her a gold award. And now she's the editor of the Washington Informer, right? It's how we are treated. Yeah, the power. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, I do have a different conversation. And it was a very, one of my closest friends who's from Trinidad told me that his mother always told him that when he would get out of line, she would say to him, if I had closed my legs, you wouldn't be here today. And he said he always got it. So there's room to start having these different conversations to get people to understand what we're talking about that can really shift
I just want to say one last thing to the brother back there. I've studied many places where, in his presentation where I preach. Fourth Sunday in August of this year will be the 25th anniversary of the last time I was allowed to preach in the church where I was ordained. There's much pain in that, to have my father in the ministry and the current pastor reject me as clergy. But I can't turn that pain into self-destruction. I turn that pain into seeing that we'll never get a chance to preach somewhere else. For me, it's the resurrection. Because God has said, if they shut you down, I'll find another place, as long as you still do it. And so, there are risks in going in the pulpit and raising these issues. But there's also freeing, not only for the people, but for the clergy themselves.
All right.
Next, we will have the presentation of gifts by Dr. Warren.
In my commitment to being fully transparent, there was, this year was a major shift from my perspective and where the center is going. This year we've decided to stop talking about the difference between how ethics is taught other places and how ethics is taught here. Other places we talk about what not to do, what's wrong. And we don't talk about what's wrong, we talk about what's right. Working with the descendant families, they've gone from shame and blame to honor and glory. And so they talk about stuff that we're going to do, and we have to know what to do. And so what this session and the other session and the rest of the week, I'm going to give you some things to think about. And you will make the right decision if you have the right things to think about. And I, again, in taking full responsibility, every panelist that comes to this commemoration, discuss with the faculty and staff, but I make the call. So, and I do that because the folks that I bring here are going to push you to think. And this session, I hope, it stimulates some thought. And you really don't have to agree. And what ethicists do, they don't answer questions. They question answers. And if you have to question answers, you're not being ethical to yourself. So raise the question and hear the answer and then come up with the question about that answer. And I hope that's what this day has brought to you. It's going to get even better, as they say, more better, as the days go on. So I'm very excited about this. And let me also be transparent, fully transparent. I've known both of these colleagues for a long time. And what I appreciate about them is that they're going to be who they be, regardless of where they are. And what I asked them to do is be who they be. So you got it. And I'm both pleased and proud by both the presentations and the generation of conversation that I hope will continue to go on. I'm not going to go on about what the speaker is going to get or what the responder is going to have, because you heard it already. But I want to say again the authenticity of what I'm giving both speaker and respondent. And I'm going to say every time, if you see a person with one of these coins that didn't speak, they stole it. Okay? So I'm going to give these to our speakers, and we have a very special presentation after we get through. And let's thank them again for their